Final debate of the day, and what the debate is going to be. A clash of the titans. Clash indicates we're going to clash with each other, but we're going to do this in a friendly manner. So we're going to be constructive and nice to each other, but we're still going to clash. Titans, who are the titans? First of all, Mr. President, it's a pleasure to meet and to introduce Mr. José Maria Barroso, who is a former Prime Minister of Portugal and the President of the European Commission. We have Saumya, Bhavsar, Head of Legal FinTech President of Meta. We have Wojt, who is an advisor to the board of the ABSL Australia and New Zealand organization. How about that? And we have Nuno Amado, a chairman of Portugal Commercial Bank. I cannot say it in Portuguese. BCP, very good. And deputy chairman of Supervisory Board at Millenium Bank. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. And well, we will talk about the dynamics in the current world, what it means. Of course, we will start with the presidential election. And then we're going to go and we're going to take the travel over to FDI, so investments, what it means for Europe, what it means for this part of the world. And of course, we're going to talk about regulations, and Nuno is super passionate about this. Looking at the number of notes that people were taking, it's going to be a very intense debate. So, Mr. President, if I can start with you, and the question is inevitable. I have to ask it. Tony presented the result and the way he sees the results of the US elections, but let me ask this. We shouldn't be shocked with the results, probably. However, what is really surprising and what is really maybe cross to shocking is how clear, how big the win was. And then the second thing is obviously what it means from your super experience and great insight into geopolitics, what it really institutes for all of us, for Europe, for the world.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me, and my congratulations to ABCL for organizing this here in Porto, this great city of Porto. I was born in Lisbon, but my family is from this part of the country, and this is one of the best places you can find in Portugal, and I will say in Europe as well. Your question, I mean, we may like or not Trump, but let's be honest, it's a remarkable personal victory. Remarkable. It's one of the most impressive victories I've seen in my life. Someone who has lost his re-election when he was president, someone who was in at least 3 criminal cases, and he was found guilty in one of them. Someone who survived with 2 assassination attempts. Someone who was tried to be impeached 3 times, and now he comes back. It's the most impressive coming back in the history of the United States. There was something similar with Nixon, but that is more impressive. Trump is the major disruptor of the history of democracy in the last decades. There is a politics before and politics after Trump. He has changed the rules, he has changed the grammar, not only the vocabulary, but the rules of communication. Not only his communication with people, but also the communication with opponents, very often insulting them, but also insulting sometimes his friends and his allies. So everything is different after Trump. And in Europe, very often we have a kind of a position, a little bit of, how can I put it, a complex of superiority. We consider that we are more cultivated, more sophisticated, more history than the Americans. But the reality is that sooner or later, the influence of the United States is huge, and people are starting to follow the same patterns. This is very important, I believe. But Trump, there's always a very interesting point with him, differently from what happens in many parts of the world, including in Europe, with the center-left and the center-right, is focusing on matters that are interesting for people. The United States have today the most successful, maybe, economy in the world. I mean, namely in science and technology, I mean, in communication, it's huge. Everybody's jealous to the United States. But Trump saw very rightly that a lot of people in America were very concerned with inflation, and namely the low middle class. And while the traditional left is now discussing issues that are very important, like gender identity, transgender matters, that the typical worker, the so-called blue collar, that's not the first priority. So what happens, as Bernie Sanders said just yesterday, Bernie Sanders, for the left, he said the Democratic Party forgot the workers, as simple as that. So most industrial workers, and by the way, the Latinos apparently, they massively voted now for Trump. So the center-left that forgot about worker labor conditions, and the center-right in Europe, we have been forgetting things about security, legal immigration, criminality. And Trump spoke basically about the border, migration, illegal migration, criminality, and economic conditions, economy. While the opponents were much more vague about these issues, at least. So I think that's a lesson there that we have to understand if we want to avoid in Europe the surge of the extremism that we are already seeing here and there. For Europe, this, of course, is a challenge. I would say of the 27 governments of the European Union, only 2, maximum 3, were happy with this result. All the others were against. And the UK even worse. The UK government, as you know, has been very critical of Trump, major personalities of the Labour Party, including the foreign minister. So they are really in a difficult situation now. But the reality is that it's the Americans who elect the American president, not us. So, and the United States remains the most important country in the world. If you had, power, if you put together economic power, scientific, technological power, military power, defense, even what we usually call soft power in terms of communication and so on, the capacity to influence, they are the number one. So we as Europeans now, and that's the positive thing I see about the election of Trump, this is a great wake-up call for Europe. And so we have to see what is beneficial from our point of view. Probably it's the time for Europeans and some of you know me, not all, but I'm known in Portugal to be a transatlantic. I'm a pro-American. I lived some years in the United States, was teaching at Georgetown and teaching at Princeton, so I'm a pro-American. But I'm a Portuguese and European. I believe we need to have more autonomy. We have to live our teenage years. When it comes to defense, we are the teenager. We are still living in our parents' house, and we have to. And maybe you remember when Trump decided to put the United States out of the Paris Climate Agreement, US being the only country in the world not a member of that international agreement, the only country, that's when Angela Merkel said, maybe it is time for us to take, as Europeans, to take our future in our own hands. So I think this is the basic thing. And I think it's an incentive for Europeans that are now meeting in the UPC. Today they are meeting in Budapest, by the way, to consider what we can do to have a more equal partnership with our American friends, because the world is becoming increasingly dangerous, unpredictable, volatile, fragmented, dangerous. And we need the United States, but we need also the best way for dealing with Trump is to show that, yes, we need you, but you also need us. You need Europeans. And that's the biggest difference until now, because that the Democrats with Biden, and I knew Biden well, he was vice president, I was president of the commission, met many times, and I met also Obama, of course, but Biden very often, he came to Europe. The difference was that Biden and the Democrats in general, I think the same would happen, Kamala, if she had been elected, they understand that they need allies. Trump is not just a problem of, he says America first. I'm afraid that sometimes it's not America first, it's America alone. That's the problem. For instance, I will not be surprised if the US leaves the WTO, the Organization of Trade. I spoke recently with some people that are most likely are going to be in the next administration. They were in the first, some of them, and they said to me, why should we be in WTO? For us, it's much better to have a bilateral agreement with this or that than to have an international with the Chinese, with the Indians, with the Brazilians, with the Saudis, with Europe, with Japan. No, we can do. And I understand their point. But then we have a fundamental problem because the order we are living in, the multilateral order, is the war that was built by the Americans and somehow also with Europeans after the Second World War. For some reason, the United Nations headquarters is not in Beijing, nor in Mumbai, nor Delhi, not in Rio de Janeiro, or not even in Paris. It's in New York. The World Bank and IMF are in Washington. They are not in Latin America or Africa, not even in Europe or Asia. So we are living in an order that was created by the United States, basically, from Bretton Woods to the but that now the most important stakeholders, the Americans, do not want to lead. They want to be somehow out of it. China is trying to do exactly the opposite. China is the rising power. Are the ones who go to see our competitor Guterres, Mr. Secretary General, what can we do for you? How can we reinforce the United Nations system? And so we have to define our position. So I think that the victory of Trump, we may like him or not, as you understand, this is not my type of leadership. Trump, to be honest, is the kind of, when he was a young man, the kind of boy that my mother would never let me play with. But assuming, that's my perspective. Having said that, we have to respect the vote of the American people. We cannot, when we don't like the result, we cannot say they are not Democrats, we cannot say that. We have to understand the reasons, and we have to adapt, to recalibrate our policies, and to try to have a constructive relation with the United States, but on the basis of our own interests and our own values. Voilà.
Brilliant. Wonderful insights. I'm tempted to ask one more, but I will be back to you, Mr. President. Let's travel across Atlantic. Saumya flew from San Francisco, and yes, that's your mic. And question to you, Saumya, fine. This is the result. We need to respect it from geopolitical point of view, what it means for the FDI, what it means for the direction of travel of the investment, the way you see it from cross-Atlantic. This particular sector has been super resistant to any kind of crises, right? Including COVID. We've shown our muscles, we've shown our strengths. We were joking that always that if it's worse, it's better for this particular sector. But with the current nearshoring, friendshoring discussions, heavy discussions about potential tax implementation, what it means for the direction of travel of the investment, please.
So thank you, and I'm very pleased to be here. Before I get into that topic, just one quick comment to my esteemed colleague. Yes, Americans like Trump, but not all Americans, I would say. Very important point. I think also picking up on your comments about isolationism and protectionism, what we clearly see, and I think this is evidenced by a lot of the panelists that we heard from earlier, there has been a very significant change in the underlying factors of making investment decisions, right? Foreign direct investment decisions. Clearly, after the pandemic, companies are now looking to ensure that there's resilience in the supply chain. They look to the increasing geopolitical tensions and uncertainty. And when they're looking at locational strategy, they want to, and we heard that from Martin earlier, Martin Hecker, they want to have reliable jurisdictions that they can count on for their business growth, and whether it's offshoring or nearshoring. The other thing is, and we will see what will happen with the Trump administration, trade wars are inevitable. It's very clear, not only tariffs, and export controls on China, obviously that's a really big factor, the US-China divide, and to quote Yellen, it's not a decoupling, but merely diversification. But clearly, this is going to also play a huge factor in investment strategy decisions. The other thing that I think is very important to note is that Trump, I think, is very reactionary at times. And even though we think we can count on what his policies are, America first, maybe it's America alone, on ESG earlier, you know, his famous quote, drill, baby, drill. I think we know the direction of that. But some of the trends, and I would talk about two in particular, and then I'll keep it short so then we can engage in a lively discussion. One, which you mentioned, nearshoring and friendshoring. So we've certainly seen that with nearshoring, moving production closer to home. Obviously, friendshoring, I think that's very prevalent. I mean, if you look at iPhones moving from production China to India, even like the semiconductor dependencies on China. Yellen made comments actually in San Francisco at APEC not long ago to move that to other APAC countries, Vietnam in particular. So clearly the tendency of sourcing goods and services from allies is definitely becoming a very important factor in investment decisions. The other trend, I think, is what the investment is in. It's less and less in the manufacturing sector and definitely more in services, IT, R&D, software. I think what's going to be important, as we heard earlier, is regional resilience and regional reliability, having stability here in Europe of political regimes, of certainty of economic conditions. Even if cross-border investment is changing, there's still, as we heard earlier, GDP growth, and I think like the certainty of stability is going to be very important for the future direction of investment.
Brilliant, thank you so much, Saumya. Let's continue traveling west, but now we are going across Pacific Ocean and we'll reach Australia. So, Anna, I love the quote from Matthias earlier today, that Europe is a constituted of countries who are either small or have not realized yet that they're small. And how do we put ourselves on the new map of the world? Not in order to compete, not in order to be Europe-centric, but how to make it part of the ecosystem, effective part of the ecosystem, attractive part of the ecosystem. What's the CEO perspective on that?
Thank you. Well, the hard world, right? We're just going to have a boy that we don't want to play with, or our mother could not allow us to play. We know that continuously going to see isolations and focusing on me, mine, or maybe one single country policy. But in that world of complexities, actually every CFO, CEO, and every global business service leader needs to survive. And that's where the ecosystem comes to play, and that's where the role of Europe is so important. We spoke today a lot, and as you can see, together with Janusz, we've made thousands of notes. Really wanted to bring the conversations back. But there are two really important points that I want to bring to us. The first one, if you put yourself in the shoes of the CEOs, and some of them today have been sharing with us their thoughts, one thing that we have to realize, the average age of the company is shrinking and decreasing. We do predict around 45% of today existing companies will not exist tomorrow. They will bankrupt or will be taken over. It is important data because it's really shifted the way we think about a business and how we reimagine the value of our companies. The ABSL report today mentions about our new business models. I do believe that there is a new business model for the whole Europe. Stop thinking about one isolated component, not being afraid of the boy that we don't want to play, but actually take the right stage. But from CEO perspective, it's simply Tina. There is no alternative. And Tina needs to stay with us because there will be no alternative. We need to find a way how we reinvent the business. In highly dysregulated business where the climate change, cybersecurity, and infrastructure plays the role, the CEOs are looking for three main things. They're looking for the right regulation and the right legislation. They are looking for the right access to talent. And we spend so much time today debating what is the right talent, what happens to our talent. But that will be the key, and that's the key success for us. And the last one, how we build and create an ecosystem. And that's where Europe can win or fail.
Thank you, Anna, for this perspective. You mentioned regulations, and we have a person who is vicious about crushing the bad regulations. The first time I spoke to Nuno, I was really impressed with his passion of going after bureaucracy, going after people who try to make things more difficult. I have to say I'm a bit scared with the statement that Europe leads regulations. I don't know if it's not oxymoron, to be honest, leader in the regulations. But anyway, Nuno, please, what is your perspective on that? What is the call to action for Europe? Do we really want to be in the lead of regulators?
I will answer to your questions, but firstly I want to apologize to everybody. I'm the only one with a tie with Mr. Barroso. I don't know if because we are Portuguese or something, but we are old-fashioned, probably. That's a problem.
Apologies accepted.
No, it's accepted. It's, basically, regulations is one of the components of being competitive. So there is talent. There is obviously a good regulation. There is the size of the market. There is now what we call some friend shore. Everything is clear and they are very, very important. But then we have to have public policies for innovation, for investments. You have to have a lot of conditions to do that, and there are two of them that are, in my opinion, also very important and are not enough raised on the public side. One is complexity of the regulation. The Draghi report mentions something about that. We have too many regulation on central level. Then we have the national level, a second tier of regulation. Then we have regulation by the regulators, because we have the third tier of regulation.
That's three.
And everyone puts complexity on that. And then that is a very difficult environment to work. We have to have we have to have good regulation, less regulation, very, very effective regulation, number one. Number two, we have to have, in my view, regulation that doesn't want to cover all risks. We have a lot of things in regulation that is ex ante, is analyzing the risks of some innovations, for instance, and we have to have a little bit more openness to the risk. Controlled risk is important. Without controlled risks on finance, on new markets, in new products, it doesn't work. So, good regulation, simple one. In banking, it's amazing, the regulation that we have. And in my view, one of the things that we should do on a very systematical way is to compare, to benchmarking our regulations to our partners and competitors, the other geographies. We have to do it. I will give 2 or 3 examples on the banking that I'm sure applies in other sectors. Mm-hmm. Securitization is something that in the States reaches 4% of GDP, in Europe 0.203% of GDP. No securitization. Capital ratios, Basel IV, already legislated in Europe with a transitory period. In the States, will not happen. It will not happen with Biden, but with Trump, no way. So we have to have some simple, focused, and non-complex regulation. Second issue is how to finance the huge amount of investments that we'll have every year. I don't know if it's 800 billion, 600 billion, or 1 trillion, I don't know, but will be a huge amount. I know that the GDP in Europe is 70 trillion. So on the defense side, 1% is 117 billion, adding to the other part. Third, someone mentioned here, the demographic bomb. We already have more than 20% of our GDP to welfare. And with the demographic bomb, that will increase. So we have a complex situation. What you have to do, basically, is we cannot have fragmentation, and we have to have pragmatic rules to apply to the capital markets. We don't have a capital markets union. It's very difficult. It was not done because of national interests. We don't have the banking union completed. So without a deep liquidity in Europe, covering all stages of the development of the economy, and without the banking union complete, we'll have difficulties to finance, to fund all the needs that we'll have in the next years. And the next 4 years, in my view, are critical for Europe. And we have another point that I would like to listen. I'm sorry, Mr. Barroso, that is, Europe moves forward in stress situation. He knows that better than anyone. It happened in the sovereign risk crisis and it happened in the COVID issues. Okay, that's clear. We will enter, I have no doubt, in the next 2 years, 3 years in a stress situation, we could move forward. However, in the political side, internally in Europe, the things are not clear. Will not be clear in France, will not be clear in Germany, will not be clear in Italy. So we will face some internal difficulties to move forward. So that's something that worries me.
This is quite this is quite a sobering list. That's a pretty black list of things. But Nuno, let me stay with you for a moment. I just want to provoke you to be a bit more call to action oriented, because this is almost like we conduct a harakiri here.
I will provoke you, because I think the problem that we have...
I understand.
I will provoke you.
Any good example you can refer to? You spoke over... I remember we were talking about this 35% investment, 65%
just to give you an idea, the OECD did a study on its...
OECD?
OECD did a study on tax wedge. Tax wedge is very clear. I don't know if you know the concept is from a company perspective. If I have $100,000 of salary costs, what goes to the government pocket or to the employee pocket? Average OECD, it's 35%. So the state has 35% of the cost, of the labor cost side. What happened? Do you think, what are the average is 35%? All the countries that are above 35% are European countries. All.
And that's the dark side.
Yes, all the countries that are below 35% are the non-European countries. The difference between the average of the largest European countries with states, with Japan, with Canada, is more than 15%. This is, if you take in consideration all these type of barriers, regulatory, social costs, etc., it's important, in my view, that the European authorities does the comparison, the benchmarkings. One point, Draghi report. A report mentioned that, and I agree, that one vice president of the Commission should be focusing on simplification and benchmarking. In the new Commission, Dombrovskis will be in charge of economy, productivity, and simplicity. Let's see if it works. But without benchmarking, without follow-up these matters, with the political environment that we have in Europe, we have some risks. Because I really believe that we'll move forward in the stress situation. I really believe. I'm an optimistic on that. But...
I'm an optimist, but love it. Saumya, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, maybe just following up on the benchmarking comment. I think it's really interesting to actually look at the underlying purpose of the regulatory framework and the ethos that is behind regulation. So if you talk about in the digital landscape, for example, I think there's a couple of buckets. One is, in the US, it's very market-driven, right? It's not, as we have in Europe, preventative, preemptive. I think in Europe, it's really to protect the individual. Right? So there is government interference. It's to protect the individual. And maybe you have also China. It's government intervention, but for a different purpose, perhaps more like surveillance. But I do think that in that exercise of benchmarking, we have to ask ourselves, is it possible within Europe to have a more purely market-driven approach? US, as you said, they always counter Basel III, they were opposed to it, right? Jamie Dimon was lobbying to not have the gold plating of the capital requirements. Basel IV, we have the same thing. AI Act, right? GDPR, you name it. It actually GDPR became the standard everywhere. We'll see with the AI Act. But is the ethos in Europe capable of going in that direction to actually benchmark?
Of course, Titans have the rights. So how are the Titans doing? Very well.
The issue of regulation, there is a fundamental difference when we consider regulation, US, Europe, China, or others. It's The European Union is 27 countries. The United States is one country. China, one country, okay? What it means, if you want to have a common integrated market in Europe, and we have it for goods, for instance, it's a completely free integrated market, so a product from Portugal can go to Latvia, to Lithuania, or to Poland without any tariff or any, let's say, quota. So it works. Internal market for goods works. But it was necessary to have harmonization. If not, it would be impossible. So the goal of the European Union regulation should be, and to some extent it is, to replace national regulations by a common European regulation. Because one thing I can tell you from experience, people don't like the European bureaucracy, but one thing that is worse than one European bureaucracy is 27 national bureaucracies. The vested interest in our national governments is huge. And that's what is preventing, as Nuno Amado said, for us to have a banking union or to have a capital markets union. The great advantage of the United States, or at least the great, is that they have a financial markets integrated. Just what happens recently with the money it was possible to raise for Boeing. Billions in less than 24 hours. We don't have that depth of the markets. So we need a financial markets union. By the way, it's a Portuguese commissioner now that received that portfolio, former Minister Maria Luísa Albuquerque. She's very good, but it does not depend on her. It depends on France and Germany. And France and Germany, the biggest countries, are the ones that typically oppose all forms of integration. That's the point. So the point is basically in Europe, the regulation, part of the regulation, of course, I have to be just, I'm no longer in politics. I'm no longer representing the European Commission, so my level of sincerity is increasing day by day. I'm telling you what I think, completely independent. Now, it's true that the Commission, there is a dérive réglementaire, there is a dérive for more regulation. It's a culture, it's true. But the real problem, I'm no longer there. I was 10 years leading the Commission, but I was 12 years in the government of my country. I can tell you, the real problem in European regulation is the government, because it's the so-called gold plating. And Germany is a great example. They have a great legal culture, but when there is a directive to transpose, they add and add and add and add, so that it becomes perfect. This is the problem of regulation in Europe. We need some, as you mentioned rightly, GDPR. It was my commission launched the GDPR. We started discussing it in 2006. I think it entered in force only 2018 or something like that. But what is better? It's not perfect, there are some difficulties there. But is it better to have one GDPR for the 27 countries, or would it be better to have 27 regulations for data protection? From Portugal to Spain, or from Poland to Germany to have completely, or from Belgium to the Netherlands. So we need in Europe regulation, but regulation that replaces the national regulation, and hopefully that becomes more effective with those different ethos. The ethos is different, as you said very rightly. Can I just say a point to be positive and to be... Now, as Nuno said, and that it's very interesting, because sometimes in Europe we like to criticize ourselves too much, and it's true that some things are not good, but others are very good. But in fact, in European Union, to take decisions, we need a crisis to take decisions, because we need a very strong incentive to make a decision. And the example was the financial crisis. I was the president of the Commission during the financial crisis. And you remember what was said at that time, probably you remember everybody, it was the unanimous opinion. I had that discussion with Stiglitz, with Krugman, with Mr. Rubini. They all told me that Greece had to leave the euro. It was impossible for Greece to remain in the euro. But Greece is in the euro, and now it's borrowing more or less at the same cost as France. And Portugal is now borrowing at better conditions than France. So we made the adjustment, and it was possible. So the resilience of the European Union and the resilience of the euro, that, by the way, is the second global currency after the dollar. The Chinese would love to have a currency like the euro. They don't have. So the resilience of the European Union is much higher than most people admit.
It's like our sector is the same.
But it took a crisis for us to do what before was impossible, to create the European Stability Mechanism, to give more powers of supervision to the European Central Bank, and so on and so forth. But, as Nuno also said, we don't have yet completed the banking union. I put in my commission 3 pieces of legislation: common supervisory authority, the common resolution mechanism, and the common deposit guarantee. The third is not yet done. And we don't have the financial market. But no, there was a crisis to take a decision. Now, already after me, Van der Leyen. Now, pandemic. The pandemic, the Commission was buying the vaccines on behalf of the 27 countries. This is not in the treaties. But under the pressure of the pandemic, what was not possible became possible. And not only that, it was possible to have what I tried to get and I could not get. It was, you remember during the financial crisis, we tried to have the euro bonds to stabilize the euro area. Germany said, impossible, only over my dead body, said my good friend Angela Merkel. But now, during the pandemic, they accepted that the Commission raises 780 billion euros. It's a lot of money. So it's, if you translate that in dollars, it's even more. 780 billion euros on behalf of the member states, some form of debt mutualization. Ukraine, invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Now, Europeans are finally looking at some issues of European defense, investing in defense, sending support to Ukraine. That was, Finland and Sweden in NATO. It will be unthinkable. But not only they joined NATO, but Denmark that had an opt-out for European defense now is a member. So, the point I want to come positive is the following. Maybe the wake-up call now for Europe, maybe the crisis we need is the election of Trump. Because maybe the Europeans now start to think, what can we do to protect our system? So that's, because it's an incentive. You see what I mean? The problem is, because when there was one of the founding fathers of the European community, a French called Jean Monnet, said in the 50s, European community in the 50s, said, European community is going to be done through crisis and there's successive responses to successive crises, okay? And he was right. But the problem with economic decline, and Europe has been in economic decline. If you look at the last 10 years, compared with the US and with China, we are going down. In all indicators of comparison, we are going down. Because it's a slow motion crisis. It's not a pandemic. It's not an invasion of a country. It's not a financial crash. So economic decline, by definition, is slow motion. So there is not a clear incentives for leaders to do what they have to do. Because the real role of politics is to make possible what is necessary. And this is not happening unless in extreme conditions. Maybe now there will be a condition for the Europeans to be more serious about what they want to do with their own countries.
In fact, Mr. President, you've perfectly stolen my question, because my question was about, does this impose an opportunity for Europe? And the answer is absolutely, positively yes. So this is wonderful. In the meantime, we traveled the world. We came back to the citizen of the world, so that's lovely. The time is our enemy here. So I would like us to think in the context of, you just mentioned, Mr. President, this is an opportunity. No question about it. Tony listed the long list of, mentioned a long list of conflicts and threats around the world. Geopolitics, Trump, Ukraine, war, uncertainty about China, etc., Middle East. One thought from each and every one of you, what is the call to action to people, to the leaders of the business services leaders sitting here, of what they should do in this opportunity situation? Saumya, would you like to start? Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Well, I think feeling empowered. I think I totally agree with the comments. Leadership is a mindset. Taking active risk and challenges is a mindset. If there was one thing I would say is stop running away from risk and thinking that everything is going to result in the end of the world or risk, right? The whole regulatory regime of preemptive. But there's the reason why, and in fact, they were talking about VC firms earlier, most VCs fund failures in the US. It's very rare to actually have a success, but they still do it. So embrace leadership and take risks.
Anna?
So when we start discussing today and so many changes happening so quickly, I think I've got two call-outs. The first call-out goes to every CEO in this room and probably every politician in this room as well. It's a time for reinvention and a time for new model. I couldn't be more convinced than hearing this panel that this is our time. So time is critical, not because we are finishing our panel, but also because if we don't act now, nothing will change or actually will become an impact of others. The second call out I wanted to make is to every global business services that sits in this room. Congratulations, we've done it. Almost 30 years, we got our space and place in a C-level. You are responsible and the driver to make sure that the digital transformation, and you are the engine of that transformation. So take that role and lead and help us to change.
Thank you, Anna.
I would add on, because I agree with what was said before, I would add on that not being Americans, we cannot copy Americans because our culture is different, but business leaders have to be much more vocal at European level than at national level. Also for professional reasons, I know well the concept of business roundtable. If you go to the US, you have a very strong business roundtable. We were speaking about Jamie Dimons before. He was chair of that for a couple of years. Europe has not that type of vocality. I know it's different. We have to be at our own, with our own culture, but we have to add that vector to our presence in the community.
Mr. President.
So first of all, I agree with my colleagues of panel. From risk, the idea to embrace risk, the idea of being more vocal, the business leaders. And I think that's the moment to do it. Because we are, coming back to our point about the election of Trump, we are in a moment of trying to finish with some ambiguities. So there will be some recalibration of the policies in Europe. It's already happening. The Prime Minister of France, he was my member of my commission, Michel Barnier. He's a very centrist, a very moderate guy, but when it comes to security, he's embracing a much more tough position because, in fact, the people of Europe, they are concerned with the problems of security and criminality. On the climate, of course, it was my commission who launched the climate change program, by far the most advanced in the world. But to be honest, those who benefited from it in industrial terms were the Chinese, not Europeans. So we have a time now for clarification. And that's why I very much agree with Nuno. I think it's the business leaders should voice their concerns to the European institutions and to the national governments. The Commission initiates legislation, but it's not a Commission, except on competition matters. It's not a Commission that decides. It's the governments in the Council and the European Parliament sometimes. So you have to voice your concerns, from regulation to other issues. And what we need from a European, I'm sorry, I'm going again to speak about Europe. What we need in Europe is to have a real external economic policy. We don't have. We have a trade policy, but our trade policy is not aligned with competition policy, not aligned with energy policy, with decarbonization or climate transition, and even less, because that does not exist, industrial policy at European level. So we need to align those policies and get scale. That's one of the most important messages of the Draghi report. And you have a role there. Because what happens is that national leaders, the incumbents, the bureaucracies, the vested interests, by definition, they resist that scale. And as you mentioned, that sentence, in fact, is from a former Prime Minister of Belgium, Spaak, when he said, in Europe, all countries are small. The problem is that some have not yet noticed it. We are Germany and France, compared with the US, or compared geographically with Russia, or in population with India, or with China, we are very small. I mean, only California, the economy is the size of India economy. So we are very small. And so for us, and I was in the G20, I can give you my personal testimony. When it comes to crunch time in decision, where is power globally? In economic terms, power is in the US, China, and Europe, if Europe is together. With all respect, Japan, India, Saudi Arabia, Brazil are not at that level. They are in another league. And we have great success stories. I mean, you are now a global organization, ABSL, but you were born in Poland. Poland is a great example. When it was the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Poland and Ukraine are more or less at the same level. And now Poland is one of the most dynamic economies in the world, Poland. So it's a great example for success. So because they were benefiting from also this factor of innovation, but also benefiting from the fact that it was becoming a member of the European Union with all the advantage of being part of a rule of law, based rule of law, an integrated market. So, but we need that integrated market not only in goods, but we need it in services, we need it in technology, we need to get dimension, we need it in the capital markets, so to get scale. And that's where the leaders should not be just parochial leaders of their own country. They should have a global vision, not only, by the way, European, but a global vision, because that's important to be, and I conclude with Dostoevsky. Now it's not very famous, not very good to speak about Russian, but I'm going. Dostoevsky, in the Karamazov brothers, there is one personage of the book of Dostoevsky who says, my father liked mankind in general, but he hated every person in particular. So what we need, not an abstract concept of mankind, but mankind is every man, every woman, every child. And so instead of seeing the world just with national optics, we should think about every person. And by the way, a client, in terms of trade, a client. How can we make life better for each person, be it in the corporate sector, be it, of course, in the humanitarian sector? And I think that scale in Europe, we need that scale, and that can only be done if the leaders of the business community speak loud and clear about these priorities.
All right. I am pretty sure if we would be given another hour, we'll continue to have this conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, the message is clear. Thanks to the results of the US elections, thanks to the fact of all these geopolitical crises, thanks to the fact that we are completely disconnected in Europe, we have great opportunity, right? It's our chance, it's the European chance for scale. Time is now, just do it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.